First story, Friends at the New Year's Party, 1999. The night started like any other New Year's Eve, cold, dark, and filled with the kind of excitement that only comes when you know you're about to leave one year behind and step into the unknown of another. There were 5 of us in total. Me, Eric, Johan, Lena, and Sophia. Just a group of old friends, eager to escape the noise of the city for something quieter. Johan's family owned a remote cabin deep in the Swedish woods, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. It was a simple wooden structure, nestled between tall black pines that swayed like silent sentinels in the wind. The air was sharp, the snow reflecting the moonlight in a way that made everything feel surreal. We had spent the evening drinking, laughing, playing old records, and occasionally stepping outside to watch the fireworks in the distant town below. It was peaceful, almost dreamlike, until the sky changed. At first, I thought it was just more fireworks, maybe some rich bastard launching something bigger and brighter than the rest. But the lights were different. They weren't bursting and fading like fireworks do. They hovered, they pulsed, and then, in an instant, they were upon us. The entire cabin was bathed in an unnatural glow, an eerie bluish-white light that seemed to have no real source. It was as if the air itself had become illuminated, pressing against my skin like static electricity. I remember looking at my friends, Lena's face frozen in shock, Johan shielding his eyes, Sophia muttering something under her breath that I couldn't hear over the deafening silence. That's the part that still unsettles me the most. How everything went completely, impossibly silent. No wind, no crackling fire, no distant fireworks. Just an oppressive, suffocating void of sound. Then came the weightlessness. My stomach lurched as my feet left the ground, as if the entire world had suddenly lost its grip on us. I don't remember screaming, though I think I tried. My vision blurred, the cabin distorted like a reflection on rippling water. And then, blackness. Not sleep, not unconsciousness, but something else. A void. A complete erasure of everything I knew to be real. When I came back to myself, I wasn't in the cabin anymore. I was somewhere vast and sterile, though I couldn't see walls or a ceiling. Just an expanse of dim bluish light stretching in every direction. I was lying on something cold and smooth, but when I turned my head, my body didn't move the way it should have. It was like my limbs weren't my own, like I was trapped inside myself, watching through my own eyes but unable to control anything. Then the figures appeared. They weren't like anything I had ever seen before. Not in movies, not in nightmares. Tall, elongated, their skin pale and almost translucent, eyes too large, too dark. They didn't speak, not in the way humans do. The words, if they were words, came directly into my mind. An overwhelming flood of emotions and images that I couldn't understand. They weren't human, but they weren't cruel either. Their presence was detached, clinical, as if we were nothing more than specimens under their gaze. My heart pounded against my ribs, but my body didn't respond. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I couldn't. I could only watch as they reached for me. I don't remember them touching me in a physical sense, but I felt it, something probing, pulling at the edges of my mind like invisible fingers sifting through my thoughts. It was the most violating sensation I've ever experienced. Not pain exactly, but an overwhelming invasion of everything that made me, me. Images flashed before my eyes, memories from childhood, my mother's face, the warmth of summer afternoons. Moments I hadn't thought about in years, ripped from my mind as if they were being examined one by one. And then, just as quickly, the memories weren't mine anymore. I could feel them slipping away, like sand through my fingers. Panic surged through me, a desperate, wordless plea to stop, to let me go. That's when I saw the others. Eric, Johan, Lena, and Sophia were all there, lying on identical slabs, their bodies still but their eyes wide with terror. I could tell they were experiencing the same thing, their gazes locked onto me in silent, helpless horror. And then, in an instant, something shifted. The probing stopped. The figures around us withdrew, their massive, soulless eyes unblinking. It wasn't mercy. It was something else. The next thing I remember is being outside again, lying face up in the snow. The night sky stretched endlessly above me, the stars sharp and unwavering, as if nothing had ever disturbed them. My breath came in ragged gasps, clouds of condensation, rising into the freezing air. I wasn't alone. My friends were there too, scattered around me, their bodies half buried in the snow. It felt like we had been dropped from the sky, like discarded toys tossed aside after being played with. No one spoke. No one moved. We just lay there, staring upward, trying to comprehend what had happened. My body felt heavy, drained, like I had run for miles without stopping. When I finally managed to push myself upright, I saw the cabin in the distance, its windows dark. It looked abandoned, as if we had been gone for years instead of, how long had we been gone? I glanced at my watch, but the screen was blank, the battery inexplicably dead. A distant pop echoed in the air, fireworks still going off in the town below. That was the moment that truly shattered me. However long we had been gone, time hadn't moved at all. When we finally made it back inside, everything felt wrong. The warmth of the fireplace was still there, the half-empty glasses of champagne untouched, the needle of the record player still resting on the vinyl, waiting to continue a song that had been interrupted. But we weren't the same anymore. We sat in silence, the flickering glow of the fire casting strange shadows on the walls. No one said a word about what had happened. No one even suggested that we try to explain it. Because deep down we knew. There was no explanation. We weren't supposed to remember, yet fragments clung to us like ghosts. Whispers of voices that had never spoken, the weightless sensation of floating in nothingness, the feeling of eyes too large, too knowing, watching from the dark. And the worst part? As I sat there staring at my reflection in the cabin window, I could swear that something in my own eyes had changed. None of us slept that night. We just sat there, staring at nothing, listening to the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant, fading fireworks. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that weightlessness again, that horrible sensation of being pulled away from myself. My skin still tingled, like static was crawling just beneath the surface. I kept looking at the others, searching their faces for any sign that what had happened was just some collective hallucination. But I knew it wasn't. The way Johan clutched his arms, the way Lena's breath came in shallow gasps, the way Eric kept touching his own face as if making sure he was still there. It was real. None of us wanted to speak first, as if saying it out loud would make it worse. I could see Sophia struggling with it, her lips parting slightly like she was about to say something, but she stopped herself every time. It was like an unspoken agreement. If we didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would just go away. But it didn't. And as the first light of dawn crept through the cabin windows, I realized something that made my stomach twist. The night had lasted too long. I don't know how to explain it in a way that makes sense. The clocks had stopped, all of them, frozen at the exact moment the lights appeared. But the fire was still burning. The snow hadn't melted from the heat of our bodies, and the town below had continued celebrating as if nothing had happened. It was like we had been taken outside of time, placed somewhere else, and then dropped back in as if no one would notice. But we noticed. My phone was dead, Johan's too. Eric's had bizarre distortions on the screen when he tried to turn it on. Strange streaks of static like an old television struggling to find a signal. And then there was Lena. She was the first to check her body, running her hands over her arms and legs as if searching for something. I hadn't even thought about that until she did it. When I looked down at myself, I felt my stomach drop. There were marks. Faint, almost imperceptible lines on my skin, like surgical incisions that had healed overnight. They didn't hurt, but they were there, precise and deliberate. We left the cabin without speaking. None of us wanted to stay there any longer than necessary. Johann locked the door behind us, though I don't know why. What were we trying to keep out? Or maybe, what were we trying to keep in? The drive back to the city was suffocating, silence hanging over us like a weight we couldn't shake. I kept expecting someone to break it, to say something, anything to make sense of what had happened. But no one did. Every time I worked up the nerve to ask if they remembered, I saw the answer written all over their faces. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. When we finally reached civilization, the world felt too normal. People were walking, their dogs clearing the last remnants of New Year's confetti from their doorsteps, going about their lives as if the night had been nothing more than another celebration. I wanted to scream at them, shake them, tell them that something had happened to us. But how do you explain the unexplainable? How do you tell someone that you were taken, examined, returned like an object, and that the only proof you have are the scars that shouldn't be there? You don't. You just keep going, pretending that everything is fine, even when you know it never will be again. I tried to move on. We all did. But something was wrong, something deeper than just the fear of what had happened. The first few days, after returning home, were the worst. I felt disconnected, like I was watching my life from the outside, like I wasn't fully inside my own body. My reflection in the mirror felt foreign. My own voice sounded strange. I kept catching myself staring at my hands for too long, expecting, I don't know, something different. And then there were the dreams. Vivid, too real, too detailed to be just random fragments of my imagination. I'd wake up gasping for air, the sensation of floating still clinging to me like a phantom limb. I'd see flashes of those towering figures, their black eyes peering into me, their presence a weight I couldn't shake. But the worst part was waking up to find myself standing in the middle of my room, facing the window, my hands pressed against the glass as if I had been waiting for something. It happened more than once, and every time I felt like I had just missed something, like I had been somewhere else moments before but couldn't remember where. I stopped sleeping. I couldn't. The exhaustion was crushing, but the fear of closing my eyes was worse. The others weren't doing any better. Johann stopped answering his phone. Eric texted me once, saying he kept hearing a low humming noise at night, just on the edge of his hearing, something he couldn't explain. Sophia told me she had thrown away all her mirrors because she couldn't stand looking at herself anymore. But it was Lena who scared me the most. She called me one night, her voice shaking, whispering that she felt like she wasn't alone in her apartment, that something was watching her. I told her it was just paranoia, that we were all just processing what had happened in our own ways. But the truth was, I knew exactly what she meant. I had felt it too, that presence, that invisible weight in the air, like something was just beyond my vision, just outside my understanding. I started keeping all the lights on in my apartment at night, as if that would make a difference. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Then one night, it happened again. I woke up in the middle of my room, heart pounding, skin cold with sweat. My hands were on the window, my breath fogging up the glass. And outside, in the distance, beyond the rooftops of the sleeping city, I saw them. The lights, the same pulsing, unnatural glow, hovering silently in the sky. My entire body locked up, every muscle frozen with terror. I wanted to run, to hide, to do anything, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching, as if something deep inside me was waiting for them, expecting them. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. No sound, no warning, just gone. But I knew they weren't finished with us. They had let us go once, but not because they had to, because they wanted to. And what terrified me the most wasn't the memory of what had happened that night in the cabin. It was the sickening certainty that it would happen again. After that night, I stopped pretending things were normal. Something inside me had shifted, something fundamental. I no longer felt entirely human. It's a hard thing to explain, but it was like I was only half here, like a part of me had been left behind in that place, wherever they had taken us. I started noticing strange things, little details that didn't make sense. My sense of time felt off, like hours would pass in a blink, or sometimes minutes would stretch endlessly. People at work commented that I seemed distant, distracted, like I wasn't really listening when they spoke to me, and they were right, because I wasn't. My thoughts were always elsewhere, trapped in the space between memories and whatever had been done to us. One night, I caught myself tracing my fingers over the marks on my arm again, as if I was trying to unlock something hidden beneath my skin. The scars had faded to almost nothing, but I knew they were still there. I could feel them. And worse, I could feel something underneath them. The nightmares got worse. They weren't dreams anymore. They were something else. Something real. I'd wake up gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat, feeling like I had just been somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. And then there were the missing hours. I'd go to bed at night and wake up standing in the hallway or in the bathroom or sometimes even outside with no memory of how I got there. One morning I woke up with dirt on my feet, as if I had been walking barefoot outside in the middle of the night. The others weren't answering my calls anymore. It was like we had all silently agreed to isolate ourselves, as if talking about it would make it worse. But then I got a message from Lena. 3 words. It's happening again. That was the last thing she ever said to me. I tried calling her back, over and over, but she never picked up. A week later, her apartment was empty. No signs of struggle, no note, no explanation. It was like she had just disappeared. After Lena vanished, I knew I had 2 choices. Pretend none of this ever happened, or accept that my life was no longer mine. I moved to a new apartment, changed my number, cut contact with Johan, Eric, and Sophia. Not that it mattered. I knew they were still out there somewhere, living with the same fear, waiting for the same inevitable end. Because that's what this was. An end. You don't walk away from something like this. You don't just go back to normal. They don't let you. I still see the lights sometimes, hovering in the sky, just for a moment. Just long enough for me to know they haven't forgotten me. And every night, I sleep with my curtains shut, my doors locked, my phone on silent. But deep down, I know it's pointless. Because when they come back, when they decide it's time, I won't have a choice. None of us will. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe I just need someone to know, someone to believe me. Maybe it won't make a difference. Maybe they'll come for me tonight. Maybe they already have, and I just don't remember. But if you ever see the lights, if you ever feel the air go silent, if your skin starts to tingle like static, run, run, and don't look back. Because once they've seen you, once they've taken you, you're never really free again. You're just waiting. Second story, Young People at the Music Festival, 2018. I still don't know how to explain what happened that night. Every time I try to put it into words, It feels like my brain just refuses to make sense of it. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that I wasn't the only one. There were 5 of us. Me, Ethan, Jess, Marco, and Liv. We had been looking forward to this festival for months, saving up, planning everything. It was supposed to be a weekend of music, fun, and just losing ourselves in the moment. It was exactly that, up until the last night. That's when everything changed. It started with the lights. At first, I thought they were part of the show. Big, pulsing orbs of white and blue hovering above the stage. But then they moved, shifting too fast, too smoothly, almost like they were scanning the crowd. The air around us grew thick, heavy, like the atmosphere itself had changed. I remember looking at Ethan and seeing his face frozen in some kind of trance, his pupils huge, his lips slightly parted. Jess clutched my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. And then, everything blinked out. Not just the stage lights, everything. The music cut off. The screaming crowd went silent. My vision went black, but I was still awake. The next thing I knew, I wasn't standing on the festival grounds anymore. I was in a room, a massive, sterile white room with no corners, no shadows, no clear source of light. Just endless, smooth, white walls that curved like I was inside some kind of giant egg. The air was still thick, pressing down on my chest. I could hear my own breathing, shaky, uneven, but I couldn't hear anyone else. That's when panic started creeping in. I turned in frantic circles, searching for my friends. I spotted Jess. First, she was a few feet away, her hands covering her ears like she was trying to block something out. Then Marco and Liv, both standing stiff, looking dazed. But Ethan was gone. I tried to move toward them, but my body felt sluggish, like I was wading through syrup. And then, just as I opened my mouth to call out, the music started. But it wasn't music I had ever heard before. It was wrong, like layers of melodies played backward, overlapping, weaving together in a way that made my stomach turn. It was beautiful, and it was horrifying. I don't know how long we stood there, trapped in that room, listening to that impossible sound. The longer I heard it, the more it felt like it was inside my head, not coming from anywhere in the room itself. Jess started crying, silent tears running down her cheeks. Marco had his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. Liv just kept shaking her head, whispering, "No, no, no." I wanted to do something, scream, run, anything. But it was like my body didn't belong to me anymore. Then, in the middle of that unbearable song, something shifted. The walls rippled. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't wind. Walls shouldn't move like that. The whole room seemed to expand and contract, like a lung taking a breath. And in that moment, I felt something looking at us. Not with eyes, not with anything I could see, but I felt it, like a weight pressing down on my mind, like I was an insect pinned under a magnifying glass. And just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The room, the music, the weight in my head, gone. I was standing in the middle of the festival again, my body soaked in sweat, my ears ringing. The crowd around us was still dancing, cheering like nothing had happened. But we knew better. For a few seconds, I thought I was going insane. One moment, I was trapped in that impossible room, the music drilling into my brain, my body frozen in terror. The next, I was back at the festival, surrounded by flashing lights and a sea of people acting like nothing had happened. My body felt wrong, like I had been stretched too far and then shoved back into myself. My skin was damp with sweat, my heart racing, and my legs barely holding me up. I turned to my friends, needing some kind of confirmation that I wasn't alone in this. Jess was gasping for air, clutching her chest like she was about to collapse. Marco had dropped to his knees, his hands gripping his head. Liv just stood there, arms wrapped around herself, staring blankly ahead. And then there was Ethan. He was still missing. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I spun in circles, scanning the crowd, screaming his name. Nothing. People around us barely even looked our way. It was like we were invisible. Or maybe we just weren't speaking at all. I couldn't tell. Everything felt distant, like there was a barrier between us and the rest of the world. And the worst part? That eerie, unfamiliar music was still playing, somewhere deep in my head. Even though I knew the festival speakers were blasting something, we tried to convince ourselves that maybe Ethan had just gotten lost, that he would turn up somewhere, laughing it off, calling us crazy. But deep down, we all knew that wasn't true. He had been with us, right there, up until the moment everything blinked out, and now he was gone. My mind raced through possibilities. Had we been drugged? Had someone lured us away? But none of that explained the room, the music, the feeling of being watched. None of that explained why my body still felt wrong, like I wasn't fully back inside it. Jess kept whispering Ethan's name under her breath, over and over like a prayer. Marco finally snapped out of his daze and grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice hoarse, shaking. Liv just nodded, still not speaking. So we ran. We shoved our way through the crowd, ignoring the protests and confused looks from strangers. Every step felt heavier, like something was trying to drag me back, like I was still halfway in that place, wherever the hell it was. We made it to the edge of the festival grounds, panting, shaking, eyes wild. That's when Jess screamed. A real, raw, blood-curdling scream that made my stomach drop. We all turned at once, our eyes following hers. At first, I didn't see it. Just a blur of movement at the far end of the field, past the glow of the festival lights. Then I saw him. Ethan. Or at least, I think it was Ethan. He was standing completely still, too still, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His clothes were the same, his hair, his face. But something was off. His expression was blank, empty, like he wasn't really seeing us. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then his body twitched, just slightly, like a glitch in a video. And that's when I noticed his eyes. They were all wrong. Too dark, too hollow, like the pupils had swallowed everything else. My stomach twisted violently, bile rising in my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. None of us could. We just stood there, frozen, watching as Ethan, if it even was Ethan, took a single stiff step toward us. Then another. The way he moved was unnatural, like he was learning how to walk for the first time. And then, just as he got close enough for me to see his face clearly, I swear to God, I heard that music again. But this time, it was coming from him. The sound wasn't coming from his mouth. It wasn't like he was humming or singing. It was just there, radiating from him like an invisible pulse. That same twisted, backward, overlapping melody that had filled the white room. My whole body locked up as it seeped into my skull, worming its way into the deepest parts of my brain. I could see my friends reacting the same way. Jess was shaking, her head violently gripping her ears, but I knew it wouldn't help. Marco took a step back, his breath coming in short gasps. Liv, who had barely spoken since we came back, finally choked out a single word. No. Her voice was raw, barely above a whisper, but it was enough to snap me out of whatever trance I had fallen into. I grabbed Jess and Marco by the arms and pulled them backward. "We need to go," I managed to say, though my voice didn't feel like my own. My tongue felt heavy, numb. Ethan, or whatever had taken Ethan, took another step toward us. The music grew louder. And then, he smiled. But it wasn't right. It was too wide, too forced, like he was mimicking something he didn't quite understand. That was it. That was the moment I lost it. I turned and ran. I don't know how far. We ran, or for how long. Everything was a blur, flashes of neon festival lights, the pounding of my heart, the sharp burn in my lungs. I just knew that I had to get as far away from Ethan as possible. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot, the edges of the festival fading behind us. Only then did I dare to turn around. He wasn't following us. At least, I didn't think he was. The field where he had been standing was empty now, just a dark stretch of grass leading into the night. The air was thick, suffocating, but not in the same way as before. It was just regular fear now, not that otherworldly pressure that had gripped me in that room. My whole body was trembling. Jess collapsed onto the pavement, her face buried in her hands. Marco paced back and forth, running his fingers through his hair. Liv was the only one still staring into the darkness, her face completely unreadable. "We have to call someone," I said, my voice barely holding together. "The police? Security? Someone." But even as I said it, I knew how insane it sounded. What the hell were we supposed to tell them? That our friend disappeared into thin air and came back wrong? That we had been taken somewhere else, to a place that didn't exist? No one would believe us. And maybe that's why none of us did anything. Maybe that's why, when the festival ended, we just left. We didn't talk to security, we didn't file a report. We didn't even tell Ethan's family. Because by the time we got back to our hotel room, Ethan was already there, sitting on the bed, acting completely normal, like nothing had ever happened. He looked at us with this confused, slightly amused expression, like we were the ones acting weird. "Where the hell did you guys go?" he asked, chuckling. "I lost you in the crowd and my phone died. Took me forever to get back here." I couldn't breathe. My body went ice cold. We all just stood there staring at him, too stunned to speak. He looked like Ethan. He sounded like Ethan. But we had seen him out there in the field. We had heard that sound coming from him. We knew the truth. And the worst part? When I looked into his eyes, really looked, I swore, for just a split second, that they were still too dark, too hollow, like something else was staring back at me. None of us slept that night. We stayed in that cramped hotel room, pretending everything was fine, but I could feel the tension in the air like static before a storm. Ethan acted completely normal, too normal. He scrolled through his phone, complained about how exhausted he was, even cracked jokes like he always did. But none of us laughed. Every time he looked at me, I felt that same gut-wrenching unease, like I was staring at something wearing his skin. Jess refused to make eye contact with him. Marco kept clenching and unclenching his fists, like he was holding himself back from doing something reckless. Liv barely moved at all, just sat on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the floor. I don't think any of us spoke more than a handful of words the whole night. When morning came, Ethan got up, stretched, and said he was starving. "We should get breakfast before heading back," he said, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't disappeared, like we hadn't seen whatever the hell that was in the field. Marco muttered some excuse about needing to shower. Jess said she wasn't hungry. Liv didn't say anything. I just nodded, forcing myself to act normal, because I realized something. If that thing in front of me wasn't Ethan, then what was it waiting for? We left as soon as we could. The car ride home was unbearable, a thick silence hanging over us. Ethan fell asleep in the passenger seat, his head tilted slightly against the window, his breathing slow and steady. But none of us believed he was really asleep. I drove, gripping the Steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Marco sat in the back with Jess and Liv, and I could feel their eyes on me, like they were waiting for me to say something, to do something. But what the hell was I supposed to do? Pull over and demand to know what he was? Ask him if he remembered the white room, the music, the way he moved in the field? The longer we drove, the more I started second-guessing everything. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe we had imagined it. Maybe the stress, the exhaustion, the flashing lights had messed with our heads. But then, about 2 hours into the drive, I glanced at Ethan out of the corner of my eye. And I swear to God, for just a second, his reflection in the window didn't match his face. It was only a flicker, a split second where the angle didn't make sense, where his reflection was smiling just a little too wide while his actual face was completely still. My stomach twisted and I nearly swerved off the road. Marco grabbed my shoulder. "You good?" he asked, voice low. I forced myself to nod, to keep driving, but my hands were shaking. We dropped Ethan off first. He waved at us from his front porch, smiling, totally normal. His parents greeted him at the door like nothing was wrong, like their son had come home safe and sound. And maybe he had. Maybe we were just losing our minds. But when we drove away, none of us spoke. We just sat there, staring out the windows, lost in our own thoughts. Jess started crying silently, her shoulders shaking. Marco looked pale, gripping his knee so hard his knuckles went white. Liv just whispered, "We shouldn't have left him." That night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself we had imagined it. But deep down, I knew the truth. And I knew that whatever had come back with us, it wasn't Ethan. Not really. Over the next few weeks, we barely talked. No one wanted to bring it up. Ethan sent messages in the group chat like normal, but I noticed something. He never used emojis anymore, never sent voice notes. And when we finally met up again, weeks later, I caught a glimpse of something when he turned his head too fast. Just for a second behind his ear. Something small, something smooth, something metallic. I never said anything. I never will. Because I know, whatever happened that night, whatever took him, it let him go for a reason. And I don't want to know what that reason is. I tried to move on. We all did. But things weren't the same after that night. The group fell apart in a way that didn't make sense. There was no fight, no falling out, just a slow, silent drifting. Jess stopped answering texts. Marco buried himself in work, barely acknowledging us. Liv was the only one who stayed in touch, but even she never wanted to talk about it. And Ethan acted like everything was fine. Too fine. He kept reaching out, making plans, trying to keep things together. But every time I saw him, every time I heard his voice, something in me recoiled. It wasn't just the way he spoke, the way his mannerisms felt just slightly off. It was the way he never really blinked at the right times, the way his laugh sounded rehearsed, the way I sometimes caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. I started avoiding him, making excuses, distancing myself as much as I could. But the nightmares didn't stop. I kept waking up in cold sweats, my head filled with that music, that impossible, sickening harmony that didn't belong in this world. And every time I dreamed, I saw that room again, white, endless, empty, waiting. One night, months after the festival, I woke up to a notification on my phone. A message from Ethan. Just a single word. "Hey." I stared at it for a long time, my chest tight, my hands clammy. I didn't want to answer. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to. But before I could even put my phone down, another message came through. A voice note. I didn't want to press play. I knew I shouldn't. But my thumb moved on its own, and the second I heard the sound, my stomach dropped. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't a voice at all. It was that music. That same warped, layered, impossible melody from the White Room, from the field, from whatever the hell had taken us. I threw my phone across the room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I wanted to believe it was a prank, a coincidence. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had been wrong. It hadn't let him go. It had let us go. And now, it wanted us back. I blocked Ethan's number that night. Deleted every message, every photo, every reminder that he had ever existed. Didn't make a difference. The music didn't stop. Some nights, I'd wake up with it playing in my head, so loud it felt like my skull was vibrating. Other nights, I'd swear I heard it outside my window. Faint, distant, like something was waiting for me to notice. I moved cities a year later, thinking maybe distance would help. But it followed me. I'd see flickers of movement in the corner of my eye, hear faint whispers of that melody in the hum of streetlights, in the static of the radio, in the silence between heartbeats. And then, last week I got a new phone, new number, new everything. No way for anyone to find me. And yet, last night, when I checked my messages, there it was. A single text from a number I didn't recognize. No name, no history, just one word. Hey. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story. Brothers at Carnival, 1993. I still don't know how to explain what happened that night during the 1993 Carnival in Recife. No matter how much time has passed, every detail is burned into my memory like it just happened yesterday. My brother Daniel and I had spent the night drinking, laughing, and getting lost in the crowd. The streets were packed, music blasting from every corner, and the air was thick with the smell of sweat, alcohol, and street food. We weren't even that drunk, just enjoying the chaos like everyone else. But then, something changed. I remember walking down a quieter street when I noticed a strange light in the sky. At first, I thought it was just part of the carnival, maybe a spotlight from one of the stages reflecting off the clouds. But this light wasn't normal. It was too bright, too white, almost bluish, and it seemed alive. The moment I focused on it, everything went silent. I mean, completely silent. The music, the people, even the distant sounds of the city. Gone. I felt a pressure in my chest, so strong that I couldn't breathe. I turned to call out to Daniel, but before I could even make a sound, the light exploded. Not outward, inward. It swallowed everything. And in that instant, the world as I knew it ceased to exist. When I came to, I wasn't on the street anymore. I wasn't anywhere that made sense. I was lying flat on my back on something cold and smooth like metal. The air smelled weird, sterile, almost artificial, like a mix of plastic and something chemical. My body felt wrong. I could still feel my clothes on me, but I was completely exposed in a way I can't describe. I tried to move, but I couldn't. It wasn't just fear. My limbs literally wouldn't respond. The only thing I could control was my breathing, which was coming. In short, panicked gasps. Above me there was a ceiling, but it wasn't like any ceiling I had ever seen before. It was curved, seamless, glowing faintly from within, like it wasn't made of material, but light. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. My eyes adjusted to the dim glow, and I saw shapes. Tall, thin shapes, standing just outside, my vision barely moving. I could feel them watching me, and the worst part, I could feel them inside my head. I wasn't just being looked at, I was being read. My pulse was out of control, my mind screaming at me to wake up, to run. But there was nowhere to go. Then I saw him, Daniel. He was lying on another table just a few feet away, completely still. His face was turned slightly toward me, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in slow, unnatural breaths. I wanted to call his name, shake him, do something, but I couldn't even open my mouth. My entire body was a prisoner to whatever force was keeping me down. And then they moved. Closer. I could see them now, clearly. Their skin was smooth, almost translucent, gray but with an odd shifting tint, like they weren't meant to be seen under normal light. Their heads were too large, their arms too long, and their eyes, God, their eyes, were nothing but huge, black voids, completely still, completely focused on me. One of them stepped right beside me, and the moment it did, a sharp pressure slammed into my skull. It wasn't like pain, it was inside my head, like they were digging through my brain without touching me. I wanted to scream, but the sound never came. It was the most helpless, horrifying moment of my life. The pressure in my skull grew stronger, like invisible hands were reaching into my brain, pulling at my thoughts, rummaging through memories I hadn't even thought about in years. It was more than just seeing flashes of my past. I could feel them being taken. Moments from my childhood, my first day at school, the way my mother used to call my name when dinner was ready. It was like they were flipping through my life, like a book, skimming pages, absorbing everything. The worst part was that I couldn't stop them. I had no control, no way to fight back. My body was useless, frozen under that dim, pulsing glow, and the only thing I could do was endure it. The figure closest to me tilted its head slightly, like it was analyzing something it had just pulled from my mind. Then, without a sound, it turned its attention to Daniel. My stomach dropped. They were going to do the same thing to him. I don't know how, but I felt the exact moment they started working on him. His body didn't move, but something changed in the air, like an invisible current shifting between us. He wasn't awake, at least I don't think he was, but I could tell they were inside his head just like they had been in mine. His fingers twitched, his breathing quickened, and for a second, I thought he was going to wake up. But then, his body went completely still again, as if he had been switched off. My own panic grew unbearable. I kept trying to move, trying to force my limbs to respond, but it was like I didn't even have a body anymore, just a mind trapped inside a shell. That's when I noticed something even worse. In the far corner of the room, barely visible through the dim light, there were other tables, and on those tables, there were others. I could make out shapes, human shapes, but they weren't moving. Some of them looked old, some younger. Some were curled up, others stretched out unnaturally. None of them reacted. None of them showed any sign of life. I wanted to scream, to force my body to do something, but the harder I tried, the more that crushing weight held me down. The silence in that place was unnatural, suffocating. No footsteps, no breathing, just a faint hum in the air, like the whole room was vibrating on a frequency just outside of normal hearing. Then, out of nowhere, something changed. The figures around me shifted slightly, turning toward one another as if communicating, though no words were spoken. I felt a strange electric sensation run through my spine, and then, just like that, the weight disappeared. My lungs filled with air in a single gasp. My fingers twitched, and my body was mine again. I didn't question it. I threw myself off the table, hitting the cold floor hard, my legs almost giving out beneath me. My head was spinning, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I turned to Daniel, but before I could even reach him, the light returned, that horrible, blinding light. And then, just like before, it swallowed everything. The light was everywhere, burning into my eyes even when they were shut tight. It wasn't just brightness, it was something else. Something that made my whole body feel weightless and heavy at the same time. My stomach twisted like I was falling, but there was no wind, no motion, just a deep, suffocating stillness. My ears rang with a high-pitched hum that seemed to come from inside my skull. Then, as suddenly as it started, it was over. I was no longer in that place. My body slammed into the ground, hard. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs, and for a second, I couldn't do anything but lie there, coughing, trying to force my mind to catch up. The smell of damp earth and spilled beer hit me all at once, and when I finally opened my eyes, I was back. Back on the street, back in the middle of the carnival, the music, the laughter, the shouting. It was all there again, like nothing had ever happened. But something had happened. I knew it. I could feel it in my bones. And then I saw Daniel. He was a few feet away from me, on his knees, staring at the ground, like he had just been dropped from the sky. His face was pale, his body shaking. I scrambled toward him, my hands grabbing his arms, his shoulders, anything to make sure he was real. He flinched at my touch, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were wild, unfocused, like he wasn't sure where he was. I didn't have the words to say anything. What could I even ask? Did you see that? Were you there? Are we crazy? But before I could even open my mouth, he spoke first. His voice was barely above a whisper, but I heard it clear as day over all the noise around us. He said, "They were inside my head." I felt my entire body go cold. I knew exactly what he meant, because they had been inside mine too. We sat there in the middle of the street, surrounded by people dancing and laughing like the world had never stopped. No one had noticed we were gone. No one had seen the light, the figures, the room. We were just two guys who, as far as anyone knew, had gotten too drunk and collapsed in the middle of the party. But we knew. I checked my watch, my hands still shaking. Only a few minutes had passed. Minutes. But I swear on my life, we had been gone. For hours. I helped Daniel on to his feet, and we just stood there, silent, trying to process something that made no sense. Then, almost without thinking, we both looked up. The sky was clear. No strange lights, no shadows, nothing. But I knew they were still out there, watching. We didn't stay at the carnival after that. Neither of us said a word as we pushed through, the crowd moving as fast as we could without drawing attention. My legs still felt weak, my head buzzing with something I couldn't shake. It was like my mind was struggling to hold on to something, pieces of what had happened slipping through my fingers before I could fully grasp them. I kept glancing at Daniel, expecting him to say something, to react, but he was completely silent. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something, or someone, to come back for us. When we finally reached an empty side street, I grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "Daniel, what the hell just happened?" My voice barely sounded like my own. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his skin slick with sweat. Then he lifted his hand and touched his forehead, right above his left eyebrow. "It hurts," he muttered. I felt a sharp chill crawl down my spine. Because at that exact moment, I felt it too. A deep, dull ache at the front of my skull, like something had been done to us, something we couldn't remember. We made it back to our hotel room, but neither of us could sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the dark TV screen, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. My clothes smelled like beer and sweat from the carnival, but underneath that, I swore there was another scent. Something metallic, something unnatural. I kept running my fingers over my forehead, trying to convince myself it was just in my head, that there was nothing actually there. But the more I touched the spot, the more I was sure something was wrong. Daniel hadn't moved from his bed since we got in. He just lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. "You remember anything else?" I finally asked. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, but didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice that barely sounded like him, he whispered, "I don't think it's over." That was when I realized it too. This wasn't just something that happened to us. This was something that stayed right with us. The next morning everything felt wrong. The sunlight streaming through the window seemed too bright, the air too heavy. The noises outside were normal. Cars honking, people laughing, life going on as if nothing had changed. But to me, everything was different. Daniel barely spoke. He just sat on the bed, rubbing his temples like he had a migraine. I felt exhausted, drained in a way that sleep couldn't fix. But there was something worse, something I couldn't ignore. At some point, I lifted my shirt to splash some water on my chest, trying to shake the grogginess, and that's when I saw it. A small circular mark on my side, just below my ribs. It wasn't a bruise, it wasn't a cut, it was something else. Pale, almost silvery, like my skin had been burned, without ever feeling pain. My stomach turned. I yanked my shirt down and looked at Daniel, my mouth dry. Before I could say anything, he exhaled shakily and pulled up his own shirt. Same mark, same exact place. We just stood there, staring at each other, both of us breathing heavily, our hands hovering over the strange marks on our skin. I tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe we had fallen. Maybe it was some kind of rash. Maybe we just didn't notice it before. But deep down, I knew none of that was true. My mind kept going back to the moment I was on that table, to the feeling of something pressing into my skull, of something being done to me that I couldn't understand. Daniel must have been thinking the same thing, because he suddenly grabbed his bag and started stuffing his clothes inside. "We need to go," he said, his voice shaking. I didn't argue. I felt it too, that overwhelming need to get away, to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever had taken us. But no matter how far we ran, I had this sinking feeling that it wouldn't matter. This wasn't something we could escape from. It was inside us now. We left Recife that same day. No goodbyes, no explanations. We just packed up, paid for the room, and got the first bus out of the city. The whole ride back home, neither of us spoke. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, too fast to understand, but too real to ignore. The glowing ceiling, the dark figures, the weight in my skull, and something else. A sound, not a voice, not words, but something I felt rather than heard. It was like a whisper at the edge of my mind, just out of reach, but I knew it was there, watching, waiting. Daniel sat next to me, eyes fixed on the window, his fingers tapping against his knee in a restless rhythm. He looked exhausted, but I could tell he wasn't sleeping either. Whatever had happened to us, whatever they did to us, it wasn't over. And the worst part, I didn't think it ever would be. Years have passed since that night, but I still feel it. The mark faded over time, but I still run my fingers over the spot where it used to be, expecting to feel something beneath the skin. Sometimes when I'm alone, I get this strange, heavy feeling in my chest, like I'm being watched. It happens in the middle of the night, in the quiet moments when the world is still, and I swear I can hear that same humming sound, buried deep in the silence. I've never told anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? Even Daniel refuses to talk about it. Whenever I bring it up, he just shakes his head and changes the subject. But I know he remembers. I see it in his eyes. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no reason, I wonder if they ever really let us go, or if they're just waiting for the right moment to take us back. I don't have answers. I don't know why it happened to us, why we were taken, what they wanted. All I know is that one moment we were walking through a crowded street, and the next we were somewhere else. Something about that night changed us, left something inside us that I don't think we'll ever understand. And the scariest thing? I've read other stories, other people, other disappearances, all of them eerily similar. The missing time, the paralysis, the strange marks. It makes me wonder how many of us are out there, carrying the same fear, the same memories, never talking about it, just trying to move on. But I know the truth. I know what happened. And no matter how much I try to forget, no matter how much time passes, I can still feel them, waiting, watching. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you have had a similar experience or have suggestions for future horror stories, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.